the Women Changing the World podcast, a podcast on a mission to bring you some of the most amazing women I know who are doing incredible things to generally make the world a better place. From corporate sustainability to straight up magic and everything in between, you'll meet the real life humans who are birthing the new. I'm your host, Liz Best, and I'm here to amplify the stories and voices of women who are changing the world. Hello, and welcome to another new episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. Today, I am so excited to sit down with Alison Taylor. She is the Executive Director of Ethical Systems. She also teaches at NYU Stern School of Business. She's an author, and she's someone who wears many, many other hats. We talked about everything from women in power to the politicization of ESG and recommendations for posting prolifically on LinkedIn, plus how to get business to stop doing the wrong thing and why you should stop feeling like you need to accomplish anything by any age right now. Hello, and welcome to another new episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. I am so excited to be sitting down with Alison Taylor today. Alison, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Liz. It is so nice to be here and get an excuse to talk to you.
Oh my goodness, I could not agree more. I'm such a fan of you, and I'm so excited for everyone who listens to get to meet you too. So for anyone who doesn't already know all about you, would you mind briefly introducing yourself for our listeners?
Absolutely. So I am the Executive Director of Ethical Systems, which is a sort of research collaboration based at NYU Stern School of Business. And we work on questions of ethical organizational culture, all dimensions of it. And I'm also a professor at Stern. I teach required ethics classes and elective sustainability classes. And I am writing a book for Harvard Business Review Press about how business can do the right thing in a turbulent world. And I have a few other hats because I have a lot of attention span issues, but that's enough for now.
Oh my goodness, I love it. Well, we will get into all of those things as well as the other hats. I totally feel you wanting to touch many things at the same time. Before we get into a little bit more of the different kinds of work you do in your day jobs, I have to ask, because this is the Women Changing the World podcast, and I like to start with the biggest question first. If you could change one thing about the world, what would your one thing be?
This was the question I gave the most thought to over the weekend, and I decided that it would be that the world would properly value education. So my mum was a teacher, a lot of my family are teachers, and I think with education, you can change everything. I think if access to education should be a fundamental human right everywhere. I think if we had education and people were thinking and thoughtful, then a lot of other problems would be solved. So I think I would start there.
Well, I love that. And also my mom is also a teacher, so I so resonate with that. Daughters of teachers unite.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, but I'm sure you were brought up to believe you could do anything that you wanted. And I'm sure you were also brought up to believe in the value of an education. And those things both seem awesome to me, right?
Totally. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I was brought up to believe both of those things. It wasn't until I started working in corporate America that I first realized that perhaps I could not do anything that I wanted.
Absolutely. I have the same exact issue of just running into real life and being shocked. I also went to girls' schools. So, when I first then got into this very, very male-dominated world and the world of work, it was a shock to see see how it really operated, and perhaps I still haven't fully recovered.
Totally. I don't know that I have either. Well, we will definitely get into some of that. And I would love if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a little bit more about ethical systems in particular, and the work, I guess, that's on your plate these days through that lens.
Sure. So Ethical Systems was founded, I think, in around 2011 by Jonathan Haidt. He's a very famous social moral psychologist. He's written a brilliant book on why people disagree on politics and religion called The Righteous Mind. He's just written a big piece in The Atlantic that I'll send you for the show notes. But he is a social psychologist, and he had been teaching as a psychology professor for many, many years. And then he moved to Stern in 2011. And he noticed that a lot of what corporations were doing on business ethics paid no attention to the academic research. And there's all this academic research, especially in psychology, about how people really think and behave. And we completely ignore it in corporate life in favor of consulting solutions and decks, and everyone kind of copies each other. So he had this idea about getting the best ideas from academia into the business community. So his big vision is that we'll do experiments, to proper academic standards and advance the field and advance culture. And we do a little bit of that work. We also, because of my background, now do a lot of work thinking about the whole role of the corporation in society and how that's changing. So that's changing a lot. There's a lot of employee activism. There's obviously a lot going on diversity and inclusion. There's a lot going on in the whole realm of sustainability and in terms of corporations getting involved with politics, all sorts of things. So we do a lot of thinking about that as well, and have a blog. We have a podcast as well, and a network of academics. And they're all people that you would have heard of, like Adam Grant is one of our network, for example, and he's everywhere, of course.
So cool. When I feel like you are someone who I know has been thinking about and writing about so many of these topics that are very much like front page news these days, but before they were cool and really like
Indeed.
so top of mind. So I'm like curious where to start. I'm like, I want to talk to you about risk and ESG. I want to talk to you about employee surveillance. I want to talk to you about political activism by companies. But before we get into all of those things, would you mind taking a step back and telling us how you came to be where you are today? I know it's been an interesting journey.
Sure, absolutely. So the first thing I should say, well, I went to India after college. I went around India. I was really obsessed with traveling. I didn't achieve very much in my 20s, so I wanted to make this point because I see a lot of young women worried that they should have achieved certain things by a certain time, and I had achieved almost nothing by the age of 30. So hopefully that's comforting. I'm exaggerating a little bit. I did a degree in international relations, and I was a management consultant, and I worked in publishing, and I jumped around, and I job hopped, and I changed jobs every year and all that kind of thing. And then when I was 29, I got a job working for a company called Control Risks, and I became an investigator. And I spent 12 years then investigating fraud and corruption and doing diligence. I was head of investigations, Middle East and Africa, first of all. So I traveled all over the place. I lived in Dubai. I traveled a lot in places like Nigeria and South Africa and Kenya, and did big investigations. And it was super, super, super fun. It was an incredibly male dominated organization. And then I moved to New York with this company, Control Risks, in 2011, and did the same job in the Americas. So Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, etc. And then two things happened. I started to notice that the facts of my investigations didn't seem to matter. I would watch, the head of sales override the head of compliance, or I'd watch people find a convenient scapegoat after a fraud. abroad. And it just seemed that the facts didn't matter and culture and leadership mattered a lot more. So I got super curious about what I was seeing around me, and I didn't know how to diagnose it. So I went back to college and studied organizational psychology, and that was completely life changing. And the other thing that was happening around this time was I'd gotten very senior in this company, and I started to run into huge problems. Kind of couldn't get anything done, was really struggling, and I'd been, this sort of overachiever until then, and it was very, 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 very hard for me. So I also needed an outlet. So both those things took me to Columbia, and I studied organizational psychology, and then I ended up at BSR, which is where I met you. And I was originally hired to be head of oil and gas and mining, because I'd done all that sort of work in those regions, as you can imagine. But I ended up running all the sustainability consulting and working with you. And I did that until right before the pandemic, though I didn't know that. And then I decided to move to NYU. Honestly, Liz, I decided that in about 2016, I decided that by the time I was 50, I was not going to go to an office at 9 o'clock every morning and report to someone I didn't always agree with and be told what to do. I wanted to do my own thing, and I wanted to be able to say what I thought, and I was willing to take some risks to do that. And it thankfully has worked out, but that was a big, big, big impetus. Yeah, so that takes us up till now, really.
Oh, wow. That is so cool. I feel like I'm not sure how you jammed so much goodness into such a succinct story. And I love that you shared that impetus with us. I mean, certainly I think back to 2016 and the thought of like, I don't want to go to an office ever again. Such a revelation, whereas now that's such a reality for so many people.
Totally. I mean, little did I know that the world was going to sort this out for me either way. But still, I think the freedom to do what I want has been great. I mean, turns out, daughter of a teacher, maybe this will come to you later as well. It turns out teaching's awesome, and I absolutely love it. There's nothing I have been better at in my life, and it's a wonderful thing. And I'm going to steal a mantra of yours now, and I love particularly this thing you say, what if it's easy? And I think it's a very or my read on it, there's loads of ways you could read it, but my read on that is that sometimes we should play to our strengths, and I think very often it can be hard to see your strengths because it's hard for you to see what you find easy that other people find difficult. So you can often, and especially if you're a certain type of somewhat perfectionist, hard driving type A sort of woman, it can be hard to go that route. But it's something that I would recommend to anyone listening as well, to think about your strengths and maybe play to them a bit more.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, I could not agree more. And I'm sure there's many a listener who, like me, is a recovering perfectionist. And I also just really want to underline, I loved what you shared about, which, while it sounds like you did underestimate everything that you accomplished in your 20s, I also feel like sitting here listening, I'm like, oh my gosh, it sounds like you did your 20s so well, in that you tried so many things that I'm sure have informed where you are today, and also had fun and adventures. I also see so many people, and I've had some conversations not too long ago with people in their like early mid 20s who are putting so much pressure on themselves to like already have, picked a path and gotten a promotion and won an award. And I mean, that was me in my 20s. And now I look back and I'm like, go backpack around for a while. Like, it'll all be there.
100%. So I talk to a lot of students, and I mean, 100%, I see a lot of of undergrads who seem to have everything mapped out in a way I find somewhat terrifying. And I would urge everybody to have fun while you're young. It's a very, very, very good idea. Otherwise, you end up having a crazy life crisis when you're my age. So have fun. But I think so. I think that's one thing. I think also something that's really benefited me, but that is risky, is I've moved fields a lot, and I think I'm broad, not deep. I'm kind of an inch deep everywhere, but that enables me to make connections between things that other people can't, who are more specialized. And I also think you can often take quite a basic insight from one place and put it in another, and people will be like, "Ooh, that's interesting." So I think there's room for people thinking more broadly and taking more risks in their careers. So I would certainly say, don't worry about anything before you're 30, and even then try not to worry. And then it's good to keep your options open and think about having a unique profile as someone that cuts across a lot of fields.
Yes, I think that's something that's so I'm trying to think what the right word is, but that's so maybe underappreciated as a career path. I feel like so often we talk about like being like a really deep expert in one thing, but I think the ability to like if you truly would like to be a strategist and an expert at like a holistic view, it requires you to like dabble in many, many different things.
Absolutely. And it's the definition of creativity, right? Is seeing the link between two different ideas. So I think that has really benefited me. And I've had I certainly haven't had a conventionally successful career. I just get poorer. I just kind of take pay cuts. But I've had I've had a very interesting and fun career. And part of it has been changing direction a lot. So you're not stuck either, ever. I think, I think you never look back really on your life and think anything other than, I was so young, what on earth was I worrying about? So I hear that from 70-year-old women that talk to me and they go, "Oh, you're a baby. What are you worrying about?" So that's all you ever think looking back. So that's
That's
worth remembering.
reassuring. Amazing. Well, I want to come back to some of these like ESG risk ethics topics, but before we go there, you are someone who I've looked up to for so long for so many reasons, and one of them is how you think about and advocate for women to have more power within organizations, which is something that I am a huge proponent of. It's something that people who listen to this podcast are all about. I'm curious, so curious to get your take. Like, what are your thoughts on where we are today in terms of like actually getting women into positions of power and where we need to go?
Sure. So this is a great question. Let's dive in a minute. I we're obviously not where we need to be. There are horrific statistics about the amount of capital men control. Obviously, there's more men called John in the S&P 500 than there are women. We all know the statistics. So that's all awful. I have not been as furious about the end of Roe versus Wade. I can't think of anything I've ever been more furious about, honestly. So
Yeah.
that all relates to work, that relates to a lot of things. So that's all a big problem. But young women, I think, are in a different place. They're in a fantastic place. I think perhaps where I end up is that we should stop trying to adapt to the workplace, and we need to start creating spaces of our own and making the world adapt to us. And
Mm.
so that's also what I think about the role of women in the workplace. And I'm a big fan of he's a sort of celebrity academic called Thomas Chamorro Prasuic, and he wrote a book called "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?" And I
What a
he wrote an
title.
article as well. There's an article of the same name, but the point he makes is right. We maybe need to. The issue is not right that we need to advocate for women and give them more confidence and lean in and get them to speak up for themselves. Like, I like that women on the whole are more thoughtful and think before they speak and like to know what they're talking about and don't bullshit. Like, these are good qualities that we should encourage and not say, well, you can't self-promote like someone that doesn't know what they're talking about, therefore you're not going to adapt here. So what we actually need to stop doing is over promoting mediocre, incompetent men. And if we stop doing that, then everything else will fall out. So there's a whole frame and there's a whole attitude of sort of fix the women. And I wish to reject that. I see the same conversation going on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I always have my students' jaws on the floor because I'm like, I'm not making the business case for this topic anymore. I'm not making the business case. What is the business case for there being more men called John CEOs in the S&P 500? Make the case to me. So we need to stop disempowering ourselves by we're implicitly weakening our position by even participating in this discourse. We need to stop over promoting mediocre men, in my opinion.
Yes, preach. Well, I just like, I love this idea personally. It's like, I do not want to ask for a seat at the table. Like, we're starting our own table. Like,
Exactly. So this, I believe, having spent a long time trying to, and failing really, to adapt to organizations where the dominant frame was very, very different from me, I'm inclined to say, you can have a successful career in corporate America, and it is changing, and that gives me a lot of hope. But I think a lot of the time, certainly the solution for me has been to step off the chessboard and find a different game.
yes, although I feel like it can be so hard to see that when you're in it.
It absolutely can. And I was in it for a very, very long time, and it certainly did I was fine for a long time. I would have, if you had asked me these questions 15 years ago, I would have given you incredibly different answers. I would have said, yes, it's a problem, but I have got away with it, or some version of that. I was not correct. Anyway.
Totally. Well, I feel like that's only hindsight. I was just talking to a friend of mine this morning at the gym about how we wish we could shake ourselves from 10 years ago about all the ways that we like thought being a woman at work, like what we thought that meant. And now we're like, no.
Totally. Exactly. No, I really thought that what you had to do was go and buy a load of horrible clothes and be told what to do, and then maybe you would get some power to tell other people what to do, which is a depressing view of work. Like, no wonder I wasn't excited about it. So I don't really think that is not what I see in the classroom. That's not what I see people who are younger expect and think and want. And I think it's mainly incredibly positive. Almost all of it is incredibly positive. So I feel very hopeful about the future.
That's so great to hear. I mean, I feel like my experience like maybe had slightly more inspiring clothes, but very similar. I definitely had a few female fashion icons to look up to. But I'm curious, you mentioned that what you're seeing in the classroom is giving you a lot of cause for optimism. For anyone listening who does not currently have like a fired up, I don't know, 18 to 24-year-old in their life, what is specifically giving you hope?
Well, I like the way that young men seem to talk about women, and it gets only bad press. But I read in all these papers about people's ethical dilemmas, right? So people write papers about sexual harassment and cheating and all these things, and so I get to read all these incredible papers about things that go on. And I read a lot of papers from young men who are, working at Goldman Sachs or whatever, who are, it seems to me, much more thoughtful about young women and their female colleagues and have female friends. And it seems to me much better than the men of my generation. So I also want to make this point, because I was saying stop over promoting incompetent men. I'm really just arguing for a genuine meritocracy. I think young men I see a lot of young men having a hard time as well. And I think it seems to me that young women seem to have friends and more networks, and at least by your 20s, that seem to be doing better than many of the young men I see in the classroom. But yeah, I like the feelings about women in the workplace. That seems very different. It seems very healthy. It seems very thoughtful. And then lots of brilliant people thinking in a thoughtful way about business. And this is Stern, it's a finance school. It's a mandatory class. It's not like it's a bunch of people that we would normally talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And I find them thoughtful and smart and interesting and dynamic and inspiring. Yeah, they're great. They're going to be great.
That's so exciting to hear. I feel like
Yeah.
time is certainly on our side for as far as
Yeah.
a new way of working goes.
Yeah, and there's an amazing book called The Honor Code, which is about moral revolutions, and it makes the point, that people make the case for change. It has great examples, like a foot binding in China, which went on for 6 centuries, and then it all changed in the space of 6 years, even though people had been making the case against foot binding for centuries. And so I do think we're in the middle of this social upheaval and transformation. And I just hope that things like the end of Roe versus Wade are just sort of a galvanizing force that are going to make the backlash stronger and hasten the end of some old paradigms. That's what I hope.
Oh my goodness. I so hope for that.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll never forget. I was in a yoga class very shortly after Trump was inaugurated, and I was speaking to someone who just come back from Standing Rock, and she told me that she was like, this country is about to have to like really do some deep shadow work in the coming years. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that at that moment in time I ever could have imagined all the things that would unfold in the
Yes.
past five, I guess, 5 years. Um, but I'm like, well, if nothing else, hopefully it is waking us up to make some serious change.
I think the conversation has transformed. I think the space for debate has transformed. I think let's hope we could make a pessimistic case, but let's not do that, because part of it is that we need to be part of this change. So I think there's a lot going on that is very hopeful, and I do think some of it at least will come to fruition.
Yes, fingers crossed. And also, I agree. Well, I feel like one of the things that's been really interesting that's been happening in the past year or so is how political ESG, which I feel like was not even the term of art a couple years ago,
No.
but how political it has gotten. What is your take on why this has gotten so political, and how do you think that's going to impact practitioners?
Oh, sure. Well, we can see. I mean, let's start with the easy question. We can see the trouble that practitioners are running into already, because it's becoming very, very difficult to figure out when to speak up, when to stand down. Lots of issues around political spending, obviously, lots of issues around retaliation, lots of issues to do with women's reproductive rights, all sorts of things. So there's a sort of easy answer and a more complicated answer, I think. I think the easy answer is that everything in America is incredibly polarized, and it's sort of like a dominant logic. It's sort of like a magnet, attracting everything to one pole or the other. It really seems that every conversation becomes polarized. Everything sort of follows that logic in America today. So ESG is no exception. And I think we have seen, issues like climate change becoming more aligned with progressive politics. And so it makes a very good way to make noise for one of our political parties. I think the more complicated answer, though, is that we've had a bit of a myth and this is an ESG myth more than a sustainability myth, but the myth of ESG, right, is that it's all a win-win. It's a false dichotomy between stakeholder interest and shareholder value if you think about the long term. And so really ESG is just good management, and it's an objective set of performance metrics. Now, I think all of that's pretty much wrong. I think, unfortunately, I think if you're going to start talking about the role of business in society and what social responsibility looks like, you have to, by definition, consider the political landscape. You have to be making a statement about the limits of what corporations should and shouldn't be responsible for. So I actually think as many advocates of ESG and sustainability have sort of denied this as opponents. I think the idea inherently has social, political, economic components. It has its breadth is the point. And so I think it's a bit disingenuous to say, well, this is just good practice and it's just something operational and it's not political, because quite clearly it quickly does become political. So I think it's not super easy, but it is super interesting.
Totally. Well, and I think, to your point as to like why it becomes so political is because I think it's like fundamentally this question of what is the role of business in our society. There are many different
Exactly.
perspectives on that.
Exactly. And so you'll tend to hear sustainability people who I love and work with, but sort of saying it's not political, it's just the right thing to do. But that's a political position. You're making a statement with that position that about what you believe a corporation should be responsible for. I mean, I also would reject the kind of Republican idea that that capitalism is not political, because shareholder value is also making a political statement. It's a fantasy, right, about the role of business in society that says it's divorced from politics. It says there are all these sharp lines that you can draw, which don't in reality exist. So everyone's talking politics and denying it, is my view.
I love it. You heard it here first. Everyone's talking politics and denying it. Well, I am curious because I feel like one of the things that you mentioned earlier and that I know you've worked a ton on throughout the course of your career is this question of like what actually drives ethics within organizations and specifically corporations, and like how do you get people, like individuals, to actually do the right thing in an organizational context? And I know this is like such a huge question, and it's also, I mean, it is inherently tied to ESG because ideally, and we've both read, I'm sure, a million times the line in a report that says it's everyone's job.
Right.
But how do you actually incentivize good behavior in a business, in an organization?
So I think speaking up on your own is always going to be incredibly difficult. There are experiments. There's a famous Ash experiment where people go along with the crowd because it's very, very difficult, and it's difficult for a reason. Speaking up is a very quick way to ruin your career. People do get scapegoated. It is very often something that's done by people who are, for whatever reason, have some form of outsider status. I don't think it is a coincidence at all that all the recent tech whistleblowers have been women, or almost all. Also, there were a lot of whistleblowers in the early 2000s who were all women in very male-dominated organizations. So I think there's a lot more to be said about this, obviously, but there's something about being an outsider that makes you both incredibly powerful because you can see things that other people can't see, but also incredibly vulnerable. So I think that's always difficult. That's not going to change. It's not solved by whistleblowing lines, but something is changing in organizations. And this is another, I guess we're coming up with another reason to be hopeful, but employee voice has completely transformed in the past 5 years. There are all these now whistleblowing platforms where you can find out if someone else is also raising allegations about the creepy manager, and then
really?
leaking is Yeah, and then there's one called Volt, and it's women owned. I'll hook you up if you like. There's ones that try and kind of get you to use your speaking up muscles by reporting good things, but then leaking is the new whistleblowing, right? So at Nike, you had all those women getting together and basically, acting collectively. And social media and things like Slack have completely enabled that. So after George Floyd's murder, for example, every company in America apparently felt obliged to have a black square on Instagram and saying how much they care. And then there were lots of employees organizing and saying on social media, no, this is what it's like to work here and this is the problem. So essentially, confidentiality is dead, and there's much, much more bottom-up power. And I think that is separate from the labor market. I think the weaponization of information is completely profound. And then I look again at the Gen Z, I look at the undergrads, and they are unbelievably more sophisticated, even the millennials, on these topics. So I don't think companies know what's going to hit them. And I think all of this makes the isolation and makes the courage needed a little easier. And I do think over time it will transform power and management in organizations, and a combination of remote work and so on. But there's lots of things going on with countervailing trends. At the moment, companies are desperately trying to introduce surveillance, and then I'm also getting the impression control what their employees are saying on social media. But it's not going to work at the end of the day. Yeah. Even give payments for being kind of representative, certainly obsessively tracking. So I think this is all a kind of emerging conversation.
Oh, that's so interesting because I was
Yeah.
aware of the surveillance piece, and I feel like at least my take, which granted I live in my own very specific bubble, but I feel like when I first started my career, I very much felt like when I spoke publicly, partially because of what I do and did, and partially just because I have historically been a rule follower. I needed to be very thoughtful about what I said, in terms of even with the like Twitter bio, like opinions are my own, knowing that I was like to some extent representing my organization. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I've seen people really over the past, I'd say maybe 5 to 8 or so years, really start to have an opportunity to own their voices outside of their roles, because of the internet,
Yes.
because there is a platform to do so. So that's really interesting to hear that you're feeling like you're seeing like some subversion of that for employees.
Yeah, I think corporations, well, it's sort of like you can handle this well. I think good leaders would see all this as employee voice as an asset and would not try and control it, and would see it as a sign that it's a sign that you can stop problems before they start. It's a sign that you can make better decisions. It's an opportunity to be a different kind of leader. I mean, one thing we know, and I don't think this is gender based, but power numbs you to what's going on around you to some extent. So everybody needs that. Everybody needs voices and corrections from people that see things differently. And I think all that is kind of changing. And I interviewed a woman called Jennifer Say. She's been a lot in the press, so people may have heard. She was supposed to be in line to be the next CEO at Levi's, and she got very upset about school closures in San Francisco and started tweeting a lot about it. The way she tells it, Levi's was very, very upset about this and would kind of haul her in front of corporate affairs every week and basically tell her to stop. And she felt she felt this was nothing to do with her job, and she completely, had done all this branding work for Levi's. She couldn't have been more, team Levi's. But she just really resented this, and I think it's a really interesting topic because we have this idea that we should bring our whole selves to work, and all these kind of ideas, which come from a great place, right? It's certainly part of being able to be a leader and be ethical, being able to use your voice. So I appreciate where it's coming from. But at the same time, I think maybe we expect too much of corporations. Corporations can't reflect all our values. So maybe what we need is going back to a little bit more separation between work and life. And then to your point, having the space, having the voice, having the freedom to support and do what you want. And I think I would rather that than corporations trying to control what employees are doing and saying in their spare time.
Yeah,
Anyway, it's a
definitely.
tricky topic, right?
It
Tricky
really is.
topic.
When I feel like it's one of those things too that without like a formally agreed upon line, everything ends up in a weird gray area that probably doesn't serve anyone.
Exactly. So I think I would tend to say, obviously, if someone's treating racist tweets, fire them, absolutely. But within reason, I think free speech and pluralism might be a better way to deal with our moment than what we seem to be doing, which is doubling down on this idea that corporations should be speaking up on everything going.
Mm, definitely. Well, on the topic of voice and speaking up, I feel like you are someone who, like, you've been writing and speaking and thinking about the sustainability and the impact space for years, and you're prolific. I know you recently officially became a leading voice on LinkedIn, which is so cool to see you recognized for all of your work. Would you be willing to share some of your secrets on how do you do what you do?
Oh, sure. Well, thank you, Liz. Sure. Well, let me start, okay, by saying it took me 16 years to get from no followers to 10,000 followers on LinkedIn, and 8 months to get from 10,000 to 20,000. So the very
Wow.
short answer is put in the work over a long time. It doesn't it doesn't happen overnight. So what I do now, I post most mornings either something I've seen before, or honestly I wake up and I have coffee and I get in a rage about something and I just I just go on and I post. I have found that the more I think about the audience, the more I try and craft to an audience, the worse it does. It is better if I just react with what I genuinely think. I don't spend a lot of time fussing about the wording because I'd be there all day and I need this to be quick. And I genuinely want to know what people think. So I think another thing that has happened is that over the years, I have a community of people I genuinely want to hear from. And actually, I'm getting worried that's now getting diluted. And so I started I started really posting more on LinkedIn in the last 8 months. And that's what sort of happened because I was writing this book and I'm usually sort of testing an idea or I'm reacting to something or I'm just seeing. And usually by the end of the day, there'll be awesome ideas and links and articles and papers and so on in the comments. So it's sort of purely selfish. But then I think, comment a lot, interact a lot, post every day. Don't worry about it being perfect. You can kind of fix it during the day. And then if it's something you genuinely think and genuinely want to know the answer, I think you will gradually get a community and then post on other people's, be generous, make connections, all that sort of obvious stuff. But I don't think I'm doing anything other than that, showing up regularly and saying what I really think. The other huge advantage I have is that I'm not tied to an organization. And so I can, other than NYU, which doesn't mind, so I can say what I really think. So a lot of people, of course, we were both at BSR, we could say what we thought as long as it was nice. I don't have a lot of nice things to
Yes,
say.
I remember having to edit to that, which was a challenge at times.
Right. So, and before that, I wasn't allowed to say anything. So I suppose that's the other thing. How important is it to you to be able to say what you think? And for me, that was worth making career decisions around. So so in summary, I have a huge inbuilt advantage because of that. This was a long road. It was not I don't have any how to go viral advice. But what seems to work is showing up regularly and connecting and being part of the conversation and really wanting to know. So that's what I would advise. Spend more time on that than making sure it sounds great. Just put it out there and see. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yes, I love so much of what you shared, and the two things I really want to underline are like this, like there's no, I mean, I'm sure that it exists in the world. I don't believe in absolutes, but like there's no such thing as overnight success. Like this idea that it took
Right.
6 years and then 8 months, and I think so many people want to focus on the 8 months, but the
Right.
16 years is really the story, not the last 8 months. Um,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
and then I think truly sharing like your actual thoughts in a way that's inviting a conversation and that's not like, here's what I think, the like mic drop. Right?
Yes, yes. And I must say, and I hope you'll run this, even though it's your podcast. I think you're very good at doing that as well. I think you are in a different realm, in a different space. I think you're doing the same thing, or I recognize it in you, and I think it's extremely successful for the same reasons.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I'm still working on receiving compliments. And
Oh, sure.
I
This
so
old thing.
no, but I feel like it's like so I think I learned as a survival mechanism many years ago to like accept and then like deflect or turn it back around. So I'm just going to receive that and say thank you.
Perfect.
Well, you mentioned your book coming out soon-ish on how business can do the right thing in a turbulent world. And of course, I want to ask a million questions. But the first two that I want to start with are one, how can business do the right thing? Or perhaps how can business stop doing the wrong things? And I'll save the second question for a minute from now.
Yeah. The second question's a better one because, in fact, my thesis, my frame is that what we call business ethics, what we name business ethics, and I'm going to include obviously sustainability, ethics and compliance, and a lot of HR, has got absolutely nothing to do with ethics, and is it's a defense mechanism. Think of it like a moat or a shield or a deflection tool around the company. So part of it's about litigation and deflecting the lawyers, and we tick the boxes, and then we get lower penalties and bad apples and blah blah blah, and it's all nonsense. That's not how it works. People don't wake up one day and say, today is the day I'm going to pay a bribe. It's just not how it works. And then there's sustainability, and my favorite cynic's definition of sustainability is that it's the paramilitary wing of the marketing department. So so a lot of it, of course, is writing the report and doing the pictures, and so on. And it's hard to blame companies for that, but it has the impact of disempowering sustainability leaders. It traps us in this sort of spiral of suspicion and messaging. And I think we have this fantasy that if we just get enough information, enough transparency, we'll know what's going on and we'll be able to judge the good from the bad.
Mm.
But a corporation, all of that involves treating the corporation as a singular person with a singular set of interests. And that's the frame and metaphor we use. But in fact, a corporation's not any of those things. It's a system. And so we can't see a lot of things that are going on because we treat it like this precious jewel that needs protecting at all costs with all these defense mechanisms. And it's in fact a system that relies on other systems to survive. And if we can just see that, we would find a lot of things a lot easier. I think as well, we have this fantasy about good and bad companies, you know. So as you will know, Liz, you've had an interesting experience in this space. In fact, a lot of the companies that get the most flack often are best practice. So I want a great human rights person. I would start with a mining company.
Mm-hmm.
The companies that have thought most deeply about supply chains are the companies that get the most flack on those issues, apparel and food. But because we've got this idea that there's such a thing as a good company, we've got this gotcha mindset, we can't actually learn from each other, and we can't learn in real time, and we can't have the conversations we need to have. So I get messages, and I'm certain you must have these conversations as well. If I could just share what I really think, if I just didn't have to deal with the press and the ratings. I spoke to someone in Coco Human Rights last week who was saying this, it's just the press and it's just all these misunderstandings, and we have to spend so much money telling our story and on the messaging, we don't have any budget or appetite to solve the problems.
Totally.
So that's what part of what I'm trying to argue.
Well, it's so important, and I feel like, I think reporting is an important thing for many reasons. However, when you have one person or a small team that's focused on this huge universe of issues, and they're spending half the year working on a report that only leaves half the year to actually do a thing.
Exactly.
And it creates a very it creates a cycle that's not, I think, what we're ultimately trying to incentivize in this space.
Absolutely. So yeah, interesting times, but again, I think there's lots of amazing people now getting more power and getting more budget and getting more influence, and these issues have never been more important. So I encourage everyone to keep fighting the good fight, but I think we need to have a somewhat different conversation and different expectations in order to move the needle. Maybe we need to focus on companies being good-ish, not perfect.
Yes, well, I feel like so much of what's been the conversations that have been happening in my world over the past week and a half or so are around this idea of like, what about, instead of everything being perfect, what if things are medium? What if instead of like working the hardest and giving your best effort, you give like your medium effort? And I think that like a medium approach to like, how can we like give a medium effort to reporting and then maybe save our hard effort for the actual stuff, or go for good-ish. I think there's a lot of juice there.
Absolutely. And I think, but also strategically, right? I think ESG perpetuates this idea you can solve 40 things. And I think the most successful companies tend to be very, very, very focused, because in any real life organization, you're not really pushing ambitiously on 40 goals. You're just not. So I think I would rather see, a company really taking its diversity goals seriously and trying to do something properly across the whole business, not just hiring a head of diversity and calling it a day. And I think you can only do that if you focus on a few things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish I remembered where I first heard or read this, but that the word priority use was singular. It was just the one. now
Exactly.
We have so many. Well, I'm curious to hear, to the extent you're willing to share, what has the book creation process looked like for you so far? I know writing a book is no small undertaking.
It's been super tough. I'm not going to lie. I feel unqualified to give advice since I'm still in the middle of it. But I've done about 100 interviews. I have a lot of words on the page. It seems that kind of like LinkedIn, doing it every day a little bit and making yourself do it and being in a rhythm, you do get breakthroughs sometimes. But I'm a year in and it still very much depends what day you catch me. It is a big reason I spend so much time on LinkedIn, and I genuinely do want ideas and thoughts and comments and critiques and all sorts of things. So social media, contrary to popular opinion, is currently keeping me sane, not driving me insane.
Oh, that's awesome. And if you don't know yet, that's totally fine too, but do you have an approximate idea of when you're hoping it will be out in the world?
I hope next year. It may not be. I'm going to try and get it done. I'm going to draft to my editor by Thanksgiving, otherwise Christmas. So I'm certainly halfway through at least getting the first draft in. I don't know that I would recommend this to anyone yet as a thing. But if I survive, I'll come back on your podcast in 3 years and tell you how great it was.
Oh my goodness. I cannot wait. Maybe sooner than then, right? 2024. I'll be like, wow, remember when I was writing every morning?
Yeah.
I love it. Well, One of my favorite questions to ask people on the podcast is if they could give their younger selves advice. I know you already had a little bit of advice. We've had lots of advice that I think has been just gold on the podcast. But is there anything you wish you could tell younger Alison?
I mean, stop obsessing about your weight and your love life is, I think, what I would say if I had 10 seconds. But I think, yeah, stop being obsessed with what you are supposed to have done by when. Forget it all. It's all absolutely the biggest waste of time. Don't worry spend no more time thinking about what you're supposed to have done by when.
Yes. Well, and in a similar vein, one of my favorite things to ask about on the podcast is someone who's surrounded by a sea of handwritten inspirational Post-it notes. I aspire to one day get like a deck of Post-it notes printed with all of the messages from the podcast guests that we've heard so far. If you could write something, or if you're looking at a Post-it note yourself right now that's like just a note to self from Alison Taylor, what would you want to put on your Post-it note?
I'm going to paraphrase George Bernard Shaw, who said, "The reasonable woman adapts herself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to herself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable woman."
You just gave me the chills. I love that. At a moment of being nervous, like, where is this going?
It's obviously George Bernard Shaw wrote it with man, the reasonable man, but I of course have made it the unreasonable woman.
So fun. Cheers to unreasonable women.
Absolutely I had a drink with someone at the weekend who I hadn't seen in a very long time, and he was like, "Well, yeah, you're Alison, you're a very difficult woman." And I was like, "Yes, I am." And I was proud.
Yes. Thank you very much. Oh my goodness. Well, I could talk to you for hours. And I also want to be respectful of your time. So before we wrap up, would love to know, for everyone who's listening and who is as big a fan of yours as I am, where is the best place for people to find, follow, keep in touch with you, keep tabs on your book release?
LinkedIn is the best place to find me. You'll find me very easily. I'm also on Twitter. I tweet things I'm meaning to read later and little comments far more rapidly. I follow Alison T. That's Alison with one L. But you can sign up to the Ethical Systems newsletter. I will always respond to notes from people that want to have a proper conversation with me or have something to share. I genuinely get a huge kick out of hearing from everybody. So be in touch.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely, I feel like there's so many links for us to include in the show notes, so we'll be sure to include links to all of those things here for people who want to keep in touch. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. Please rate and review the Women Changing the World podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe for future episodes. You can find me on Instagram. My handle is liz.best, that's lis.best, or you can find me on LinkedIn by searching my name, Liz Best. Join my mail list by visiting elizabethbest.com/monthly-meditation, and you'll receive all the latest updates on events, retreats, and opportunities to work with me, plus a monthly love note from my heart to your inbox. I am so excited to keep in touch, and I'll see you in the next episode.